In this final section, we're going to look at the relationship between the individual and organisational context when we're talking about ethics, particularly how the individual's ethics can affect the organisation, and really importantly, how the organisational context can affect an individual's ethical decision making. To do that, we first need to look at what we mean by a person's individual ethical standards. Then we look at some of the factors, not all, but a few of the factors about an organisation or an institution that can affect an individual's decision making. So why don't we hop into it? So the first thing we want to look at is this idea of a baseline, right? If we're going to look at the interaction between an organisation and an individual and how that affects ethical decision making, we need to know what the individual's baseline is. And in this sense, we'd talk about someone's moral principles. We'd also talk about their integrity. So they're the two kinds of concepts we're going to deal with. Now, moral principles is about more than strong principles and strong principles in a context. So here we've got this idea of a context of a crime syndicate. And just because you're loyal to those in the crime syndicate and are very thoughtful and helpful to those in the crime syndicate doesn't actually mean that you're being ethical, right? Because you're not replicating that outside the crime syndicate. So even though you're consistently adhering to the principle that you have, it may not be considered ethical. You might have heard about the phrase, honour among thieves, yeah? Honour among thieves. And really, if you look at that, what you can start to see is an element of relativity in the application of this principle, applying it to one group but not the other. So normally when we're thinking about moral principles, we tend to think about the idea of what's good, okay, so what's a good or right thing to do, and we're dealing with that good thing in relation to the self and other. So it's far more about not what's good for you, but it's what is good in the sense of your relationship with others. And when we start thinking about moral principles that way, about an element of, for most elements of ethics are an element of self-sacrifice with the other, for the other, in terms of goodness. We're going to deal in the next few weeks with some ways of judging what is a moral principle and what is not. But once we have a moral standard from some of those models, that becomes embedded at the individual level when they accept it, when they accept and believe that that's the approach they should take. When you accept a moral principle, what it means is that you will be both motivated to follow the principle, so you'll want to do it, and you will also be motivated not to break the principle. Okay, so the classic that we'd think about is you'll feel guilty if you do something wrong. It also means that then you set up in your own head a way to judge acts. You can judge the act against that moral principle yourself, if you do it and you'll feel guilty, but importantly, you can also judge others. And so you'll think someone is doing the wrong thing. Why? Because it breaches the moral standard that you've accepted. So here's a very simple example. We've got a salesperson who accepts the principle that you shouldn't mislead customers. So they're going to be motivated to act honestly, right? So they're naturally going to want to tell the truth, and they're going to feel guilty if they don't. They're also, right, going to judge and think other salespeople who do mislead their customers are wrong. Okay, so it leads to that criticism. If you consistently maintain these principles over time and context, so not just at work, not just at home, and not just on the sporting field, if between these contexts you consistently maintain these principles, people will say that we have integrity. Okay. Now we're going to examine how do we judge these standards? How do we judge an action against a standard? We're going to look at that in week 2. We've got some models to do that. And we're also going to look at, how does a moral individual develop? Okay. And how do we judge the characteristics that are necessary to be ethical and moral? We're going to look at that in week 3. So we're going to have a way of judging those standards. For now, if we have accepted the standards and we maintain them over time and in different contexts, then we'll say we've got integrity. However, there are forces at work that can influence whether or not we act consistently across different times. Importantly for business, we have institutions, institutions like markets and government, and we have organisations that influence our ethical behaviour. One way to think about this ethical behaviour problem is through the metaphor of the apples in the barrel. You've probably heard it before, but for those who haven't, imagine you've got a large barrel and it's full of apples. Now, we all know that disease in a fruit spreads, right? So if you put a few bad apples into a barrel of good apples, it can spread. The idea here is that, is it the unethical individual in an organisation that allows the spread of unethical acts through to other individuals in the organisation? A second way of looking at it, though, is if you have a barrel that has disease in it and you put good apples in, then it's likely that those apples are going to get infected. So is it the organisational systems that we have in place that cause or lead to the individuals acting unethically? Does it spread from the organisation to the individual? And the third way of thinking about the particular problem is we can have if we have a clean barrel, right, it's less likely our apples are going to be infected and infect others. So organisational systems and organisation can act as a constraint on unethical behaviour. And that's really what this slide is saying. Is it the individuals that affect the organisation, or is it the organisation that affects the individuals? And further, can we set up an organisation in a way that limits the unethical individuals? Fortunately, we've got some well-known research around these particular topics. There's a lot of work done in this area, and I'd suggest that you have a really good look at Basserman for some of the ideas, that Basserman reading around that. We're going to deal with 3 core kind of ideas. The first is that there are ways of doing things in organisations that we would tend to call norms and culture. So it's really a kind of standard about how we do something is a norm. So in organisations, there's a norm. So if you're at school and you're dealing with a teacher, there's a norm of how you talk to the teacher if you're a student and how you address them. You tend to use their title and last name, so it's Mr. Nicholson, etc. When you move to an organisation like a university, while it's still a teaching setting, many lecturers will be quite fine in a personal interaction for you to call them by the first name. So you call me Gavin. Okay, now some lecturers not, but we have that norm that it's probably more acceptable. So we can see a difference in norm even across an institutional setting like a learning environment. So corporations and all organisations have these norms about how they do things. And one of the key ones that we deal with is about goals, right? So do we have goals? Do we drill them to the individual level? Are they linked to performance, to pay? And then what happens if you meet or don't meet those goals? Right? How you deal with that and how we target goal setting can have a huge impact on whether people act ethically or unethically and about what is seen as right. And those goals, or making sure you hit, for instance, sales targets, may conflict with an individual's moral principles. So our salesperson from before who wants to act honestly may find that being very truthful about the product leads to a drop in sales. So do they start not following their personal moral principle to hit the organisational goal, or do they keep missing the organisational goal? Those kind of effects around just more than goal setting too are important factors in ethical behaviour and decision making in organisations. The second area, and it's a well-known area of psychology around conformity, and there's lots of different mechanisms or effects. We have here too, conformity and groupthink, and really what we're dealing with is a form, or it's not strictly speaking, but a kind of form of peer pressure, right? When everyone else thinks we should behave a certain way or make a certain decision, and it conflicts with your ethical take, do you conform or do you speak up against the rest of the group? There's a lot of evidence that it's very difficult to speak up against the rest of the group for a host of reasons. And we work in organisations, generally in teams and groups. So these kinds of effects are going to have a significant impact on the behaviour and actions that we take ethically. The final principle that we deal with is diffusion of responsibility. What that means is that often when we make decisions or engage in certain behaviours, we may not be responsible for it in terms of having line authority. And then when no one's responsible for a decision or a course of action, what we find is that people often don't allow their personal ethics to guide their actions. Here's a way of thinking about it. Imagine you're on some public transport and a person on the public transport, say on the bus, makes a disparaging comment to another customer. It might be racist, might be sexist. Do you say anything, or do you stay silent? Right? There's a great deal of research that a lot of us will actually stay silent, and it's not because we're not ethical. We don't think that what they're saying is wrong. It's just that we really don't see it as our role to step in. There's this diffusion of responsibility across all of the people on the bus. No one's really responsible, so no one steps in. And that is another force at work when we have large organisations with bits of the organisation taking different parts of the decision process. Okay, so that's a fair bit of information in the first lecture about ethics, what it is, and how it works in an organisational context. The next step for you is to start applying that. And we've got a whole host of problems there or cases for you to have a look at. And it's really important that you do try and apply these cases and get some feedback about how you're going. Hopefully, we'll be able to do that a bit in lectures, but also on your own. So that's it for the first section, and we'll look forward to next week.